Farmers are furious. Across Europe, farmers have erupted in non-stop protest. And yes, manure was slung. But at what?
On nous impose de plus en plus de normes.
The EU has decided to listen only to the very big farmers and to agribusiness.
On aimerait pouvoir en vivre, quoi.
They say they're struggling to make ends meet and blame those at the top for it. That's not necessarily new, but something's different this time.
It's so emotional. I think that's new.
It's fairly little things, I think, that are sort of the straws that are breaking the camel's back.
These little things, though, seem to be symptoms of bigger, more complex problems that have been brewing for decades. So what are the real issues at stake, and how can we fix them? First, let's take a closer look at the protests. Farmers have been demonstrating all over the continent, from Portugal to Latvia to Romania to France.
On a plein de normes européennes, mais très spécifiques, qui est vraiment où, pour finir, on ne sait plus produire à bas prix.
On a envie que les choses changent, parce que c'est un métier qui est notre passion finalement.
Some issues are more localized. In France and Germany, the demos have focused on the reduction of diesel subsidies.
Diese Agrardiesel-Rückerstattung mit 21 Cent, das bedeutete für uns immer 25.000 € Erstattung.
Wenn uns jetzt noch die Subventionen gestrichen werden, dann weiß ich tatsächlich nicht mehr, wie es funktionieren soll.
Farmers in Greece are still reeling from floods in 2023 and are also demanding faster compensation for damage from natural disasters. In Hungary and Poland, farmers complain about imports of cheap grain from Ukraine. Since Russia's invasion, the EU has waived tariffs on Ukrainian grain and produce as a measure of support after Russia blocked major Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea.
Niestety rządzący nie chcą z nami rozmawiać, dlatego przyjechaliśmy dziś do Warszawy, żeby pokazać siłę polskiego rolnika.
But whether it's diesel subsidies, flood damages, or grain imports, there's a common thread running through all the protests. Farmers feel left alone and overlooked by their governments. And if we look at the cold, hard numbers, this might well be true.
It's just a fact that over time, agriculture tends to shrink relative to other sectors of the economy.
Stefan von Kramon-Taubadel is an economist whose research analyzes agricultural policies. He's been a consultant to the World Bank and several national governments.
And this is true almost everywhere in the world. I can't think of any real exceptions.
This is because GDP growth becomes more and more concentrated on industrial goods, and especially services, over time. European farms are dying out, decreasing by roughly a third since 2005. Still, 8.7 million people worked in European agriculture in 2020, and that doesn't include seasonal workers, who often labor under precarious conditions. Farmers across the globe are experiencing disproportionate amounts of mental health problems compared to the general public. In Europe and the US, the farming population has shown elevated suicide rates.
Being a farmer is not only having the job as a farmer, but really giving all in.
Marie von Meyer-Höfer is an agricultural economist who researches the social side of sustainable food systems.
It's a way of life, and that's why it's so emotional.
Farmer suicide rates in India, the world's most populous nation, are dire. In 2022, at least 30 farmers took their own lives every day. And we can look again to the shrinking role of agriculture here.
Economically, it has swinged significantly. Now it is only around, say, 15% of the country's GDP.
Brajesh Jha is an agricultural economist at India's Institute for Economic Growth.
But 50% people are directly or indirectly dependent on agriculture. And this creates a bad situation like this.
Protesters gathering in the breadbasket northern state of Punjab want the government to guarantee a minimum price for all their crops.
Here I am in support of them. It gives sufficient impetus for farmers to adopt technology to widen their profit. And moreover, see these prices crashes in certain regions because of infrastructure lack.
So whether it's India or Europe, farmers are struggling. They're losing relevance in our economic system, and it shows the ways in which the system is stacked against them.
The wealth across the value chain is not distributed in a fairly manner.
Ivan Ivanov is the political secretary of a federation that advocates for European farmers and farm workers.
Retailers and big food manufacturers are getting like the biggest share of the value which is produced in the agri-food sector, and farmers and farm workers, which are like in the bottom of this value chain.
Giant supermarket chains have massive negotiating power over prices. A European Commission survey found that 96% of suppliers in the EU food chain reported that they experienced at least one form of unfair trade practice.
Wir stehen alle aufgrund der desolaten Preise mit dem Rücken an der Wand
Und da kann es nicht angehen, dass solche Konzerne immer noch nur auf den Preis achten.
Trade deals often add to their plight. International agreements like the proposed EU-Mercosur deal would increase agricultural imports from Latin American countries. Farmers complain it's cheaper and produced at far lower standards.
Venir des denrées alimentaires qui ne sont pas produites comme chez nous, les négociations en ce moment sur nos prix, donc des négociations qui sont faites avec la grande distribution et les industriels ne se passent pas bien. Donc on demande que tout ça soit mis à plat et qu'on ait des réponses rapides et concrètes.
Ivanov says the agricultural sector often takes a back seat in negotiations, leaving social and environmental factors unaddressed.
The agriculture or the food sector is often used as a bargaining chip to get some trade-offs in other sectors, more industrial, more luxury goods.
In Europe, there's a pretty easy target for all that pent-up manure: the EU Commission in Brussels. That's because the Commission controls the other huge thing farmers resent, the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP for short. Launched in 1962, it's the EU's overarching framework that was initially founded to deal with post-war food scarcity. Almost 3/4 of the CAP budget goes to direct payments for farmers. But size is the only thing that matters there. Payments are calculated based solely on how big the farm is.
The linkage of the subsidies to the farmland is one of the biggest problems, because it gives the favor to the ways of production that we want to change.
This means the policy rewards industrial farms, which tend to be monocultural corporations. For example, one of Europe's biggest arable farms is Agrikost, a Romanian cereal producer. UAE investors bought it for reportedly between 200 and 300 million euros, but the farm still gets over 10 million annually in EU subsidies. Romania exports a large majority of its grain, meaning the yield from these massive farms is not benefiting the local economy. Most European farms are small, however. 2/3 are less than 5 hectares. And almost all of those are family farms with an aging population.
Die junge Generation hat Angst. Ich höre von ganz vielen, wir haben Angst, kriegen wir überhaupt noch einen Job später, wenn das alles so umgesetzt wird, wie es eben geplant ist.
As if all that weren't complex enough already, enter climate goals. Europe has lofty plans to become the first climate-neutral continent by 2050. Agriculture is responsible for more than 10% of total EU greenhouse gas emissions.
Relative to the size or the overall economic importance of the sector, it produces disproportionately a large share of greenhouse gases.
So what did the European Commission do? Make a Green Deal. Along with the farm-to-fork strategy within it, this policy tries to make food systems more sustainable.
We can afford kind of to think about the extra issues, like environmental protection, like biodiversity, like ethical issues.
And this is where we start running into tensions. Farmers have revolted against Green Deal policies, like phasing out diesel subsidies, reducing fertilizer and pesticide use, and setting aside land for biodiversity. They say the rules don't compensate them for the income loss, and that farmers are taking too big a share of the responsibility. So is there something about all of this that just isn't working?
A lot.
The problem with the policy is that it is a bit schizophrenic. If it's meant to be income support, then you think, you should be targeting smaller farms with low income more and not the big farms. The question is whether it's really designed to be income support in the first place.
Because if the purpose of the policy is for environmental welfare,
well then a big farm should be getting more payments, because a big farm is affecting in the environment on a much larger number of hectares. The main problem, at least from my perspective as a policy analysis, is that the policy it's not really clear what the main priority is. You're trying to pursue two different goals with one policy and with one tool, and that's not really effective.
So far, the European Commission has backpedaled on some of its policies because of the protests. France dropped its fuel subsidy cut, and the EU scrapped a plan to reduce pesticides. As for Ukraine, the European Commission will extend its trade support deal until 2025, but added a measure to prevent too many Ukrainian products being sold in EU states. But all of this might just be popping painkillers. For long-term solutions, a bigger shift in policy would be needed to help farmers and address climate change. One solution could be to focus the EU policies around the environmental aspects of the food system, not subsidies.
Income support is in the European Union a national policy priority. The social policies are national priorities that shouldn't be coming from Brussels.
It would then be up to the individual member states to support their farmers. They would have more flexibility in shaping their subsidies, which could support smaller farms and create incentives and financial support for more ecological practices. Changing the food system, of course, implicates me, you, the consumer. Right now in the EU, the environmental cost simply isn't priced enough into our purchases. Raising those prices would be necessary and in turn change our consumption habits.
It's not going to affect me with my professor's salary, but it's going to affect, a single mother with kids to feed who's got a lower salary. And policymakers are going to have to find ways of buffering that and distributing the load. But the load has to increase.
Don't expect anything to happen in Brussels before Europe-wide elections in June 2024, though. In the meantime, some worry that the farmers' movement has already been co-opted by right-wing parties seeking political gain. And getting back to that anger, smaller farms and their workers also need a bigger seat at the table.
Nous sommes des personnes de la terre, de la nature. C'est notre passion. Les gens qui pondent cela, ce sont des gens qui sont sur un bureau. Ils connaissent peut-être même pas ce que c'est de la nature.
We have a problem with whose interests are represented. Actors who are more or less have interest in keeping more or less the status quo. And there are also quite influential ones who are very much shaping all the political agenda.
For farmers in India, price controls look necessary given that roughly 50% of the country's workforce is in agriculture. In the long run,
they definitely deserve see more subsidies from government.
Zooming out, maybe a healthy dose of reality is needed in thinking about climate change and the struggles of agriculture.
Agriculture is a sector that's probably never going to be completely climate neutral. That's just, but the nature of things. That said, we're talking about food, which is a necessity. There's other sectors of the economy that produce things that aren't perhaps quite as necessary.
At the end of the day, farmers are the ones providing our food. Their anger is understandable. They're being squeezed in a huge system that stockpiles wealth for the biggest players, and they're facing more and more rules without any fundamental change of that system. Are the farmers protesting where you live? And how do you think about food security? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe. See you next time.